Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Data Slayer podcast. This is where insight meets impact, brought to you from the team at Blue.Point Supply Chain Solutions. So this is our first episode. So today we're going to start with some introductions of some of our team members, as well as an introduction to Blue.Point itself. So I'll start with myself. I'm Jennifer Doty. My role at Blue.Point is the Senior Business Development Specialist. And on the podcast, I am your host. My role will be to kind of guide the conversations, make sure all our questions get answered, and that we stay on point. Next, I'll turn it over to Anne-Marie to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Anne-Marie Orlando. I am the VP of Clinical Services here at Blue.Point Supply Chain Solutions, and I am a clinical subject matter expert.
Okay, and Keaghan?
Hi, I'm Keaghan Smith. I am a product manager and analyst with Blue.Point Supply Chain Solution. And yeah, I'm the analytic subject expert.
Perfect. And Sarah?
Hi, I'm Sarah. I am the clinical program director here at Blue.Point, and I am help alongside Anne-Marie as the clinical subject matter expert.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for joining me today on this first episode. From time to time, we will have other team members join us on our subject of the day and other subject matter experts, and hopefully some guests will be joining us as well. So now that we're done with the who, before we get to what Blue.Point is, let's first talk about why Blue.Point even exists and the problems that it has solved. I think Anne-Marie or Sarah might have stories from their time working in facilities that needed some supply chain solutions.
Yeah, I think as a supply chain director, one of the biggest obstacles I had was space. That was not a clinical issue, but really, a spatial issue in terms of stocking supplies. And walking into some of our supply rooms, there's only so much room in some hospitals, and you really need to streamline your options. But flipping that to the clinical perspective, when you have a lot of choice within the product types that you have at your facility, there's a lot of potential for variation. And that means variation in the products that your nurses are choosing. That means variation in the products that the patients have access to or have applied to whatever wound type that is, if we're talking wound care dressings. And that also means that there's variability in the outcomes in those patients. So how can you track that? And it's really important to be able to understand how that all plays into patient care. When you have that type of overuse, or I guess, how would I say that? When you have that many options, I guess is what I'm trying to say. When you have that many options, that we know that from a research perspective, that increases the types of outcomes and variability in the outcomes. So having a way to be able to not only streamline the options, but also have better outcomes and making sure that they align to the clinical practices, I think is the piece. It's not just about removing the items or not using the good items, right? And going to the cheap items. I think that's what I heard a lot from my nurses was saying, oh, you're just making me use a cheaper item. And that's not the case. That's not what we want. But sometimes, yeah, you do. A Band-Aid's a Band-Aid, right? That is what you need at the end of the day. But sometimes, yeah, you need that more expensive dressing. You need that silver dressing. But how do I know when to use that silver dressing? And how do I know when to use maybe an alternative that's not as costly? And how can I make sure that my nurses, when they walk into the supply room to choose the dressing to dress their wounds for their patients, how can I help them make a better decision? Because if you think about how many decisions a nurse has to make just to even, dress a wound, first it's what kind of wound am I dealing with? Then they stare at a wall. What is the dressing that I need? What is the size of the dressing of what I need? Should I use silver? Should I use PHMB? Should I use honey? Right? And then do I need to cover it with a clear dressing? Should I, or does it already have an adhesive to it? So there's a lot of little decisions that these nurses have to make along the way. And how can we better provide them with a more streamlined experience, and also the patient a better experience and a better outcome?
Right, because then overall would also, we don't want the nurses thinking about having to save the facility money in those situations either.
Oh, yeah, no, that
like,
is
we don't
one
want
thing you
them to-
never, that is the
That-
least thing that's in the back of their
Right.
mind when they're taking care of the patients is, you know, what is the cost of this dressing, right? Or what is the cost of, you know, that patient's care. That's always the last thing that we're thinking about, just making sure we have what we need.
Right,
So.
and so having, you know, less options makes that as well from those who are not necessarily, you know, involved with that patient, still being
Yep.
able to, you know, have the overall goal of saving money. So,
If you're doing the right thing, I think the savings comes naturally, right?
right. That's
Because
what I was trying to get to.
you know, because you have the right product, right? We always in supply chain, right? We always talk about the right product for the right patient at the right time. But it, you know, we need to consider, especially in a value analysis perspective, and when we're looking at everything from a basically a 360, you want to also take into account the outcomes of that patient. And you know, sometimes it's maybe a little bit more on the outset for the product means a better outcome on the backside for the patient, but it's all grounded in, you know, clinical evidence, and making sure that, you know, we're not overusing products, underusing products, things like that. And how can we address that in a hospital setting, right? I think that's one of the hardest things from a supply chain perspective or value analysis perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Sarah, do you have any insights?
Well, you know, as Anne Marie was talking, I started thinking about, you know, I've been a nurse for 20 years, and I think about when I was a brand new nurse and what were those decisions that I needed to make. And I came from a critical care area. So in the moment, in the heat of the moment, you have to make those decisions really fast. And so if there's a ton of choices, how do I know which one to pick? And I think coming from a new nurse perspective, you don't. And so you need to have those, that clinical insight that might help with those decisions on the supply chain side. And so that's where I think that value analysis marries that, because then you have that clinical insight with the supply chain that is working together and helping decide which one is best and what are the best outcomes. Because say central lines, like you need a central line. Well, do I get a single port? Do I get a dual lumen? Do I get a triple lumen? I don't know. Does it need is it a custom kit? Does it need dressings with it? Things just like what Anne Marie was saying with the honey and whatnot in wound care. You think about those things very quickly, but if you don't have it standardized and in a easy place for the nurse to think in making those decisions what to do, that's where you kind of, in value analysis, that's kind of where you kind of run into trouble, because you have too many choices and your outcomes are not going to be the same. Because what if that patient needed a triple lumen and I grabbed the single lumen and I didn't know, or vice versa. Like if they only needed the single lumen and now I'm exposing them more to infection because I gave them a triple lumen. And as a new nurse, you don't think those ways, but when you grow in nursing and the nursing profession, you learn to think that way. But then you go into the value analysis side and you apply that nursing knowledge to the value analysis piece to bring in the best products.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, so now I think we should get to what is Blue.Point then? How is Blue.Point helping in this situation, in these situations?
I think for me, when I was at the facility level, the thing I didn't have was what Keaghan brings to the table and her team is data, because we can't make decisions in a vacuum. And I think that when you have the data, whether that's clinical data, that's usage data, that's cost data, historical data, and you're able to make those decisions so that that new nurse understands when they need to grab that single lumen or that triple lumen. And it also allows you to be able to have those insight into the outcomes of the patient.
I think there was
It like
the ability to identify, through the data that we were getting, that there was a need for that value analysis piece. So we were conceptualized and then kicked off in 2015, right, as Blue.Point. And Blue.Point's focus was really, how do we show members more than just the contract and cost savings? There is so much more out there in the clinical space. So how do we support those nurses and the value analysis teams that were starting to slowly form?
Right. And that's one thing that supply chain just historically has always looked at, right? Contract versus non-contract. And if you're standardized to, let's say, one vendor, then that's great. However, there's more to it than that. And when you dive deeper to look at the clinical pieces of what they're using, you can look at those clinical product functionalities and those features to say, oh, wow, we're overusing this feature, underusing this feature, and how can we better align to the evidence that's most current?
Yeah. And so in just general terms, how does Blue.Point, how does our platform do that? If we can get like what data do we get from facilities, just a overview, so kind of understand what value Blue.Point brings.
So we get PO purchase data and issuance data from our customers, and we are able to clinically categorize that. And what was the next question that you had? I'm sorry.
Just so, and it might even come down to what actually makes Blue.Point more unique than any other tools out there. Maybe that is the way to go, to ask, exactly, because what we do, I guess the data part of it and acquiring data and sifting through the data, but what then, how is it then used beyond that, so that, and I guess it might not even come down to who at the facilities are going to be using this information. I guess that's also important to say, who are the people who are actually going to be utilizing the tool. So kind of.
I think what I've learned at being at Blue.Point is what makes them stand out a little more is that we really do a good job of data visualization in telling the story, along with providing the resources that we have tied to our references of, like, we suggest you do this to achieve these target savings and what we're seeing in your data. So we back that up. So we're giving you the whole story. And I think that's what sets us apart, instead of just getting siloed into, okay, here's your data and here's where you could improve. It's like, well, here's where you could improve. And this is why we say you can improve this way. And we have that support to be like, we know that, time and people are limited, so we can be an extension of your team on top of that. So I think that's what makes Blue.Point stand out when you're working with a value analysis company and a solution company. We really provide that whole support and story.
Yeah, we have a whole clinical reference library as well as like a project management tool baked right in.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I,
that
I
definitely.
also think it's the unique way that we categorize, the data. It's not just by the contract category. It's really looking at those clinical equivalents and how they're grouped together, how nurses would use them together, and combining that with the research that Keaghan was mentioning in the library that you mentioned. It's really important looking at
Yeah,
it that way.
definitely makes
Yeah.
everything a lot more efficient
Yep.
when you
No,
have it.
I
Yeah.
was thinking a little bit on those same lines, but it's kind of blending those deep analytics with that clinical insight without getting the cheaper product, really. And because you're
Yep.
looking at those clinical equivalents, and we're actually turning that data is actually turning those clinical insights into the actionable items that the end users can look at, which drives that evidence-based decision and
Yep.
cuts the quality or cuts the cost without cutting the quality.
That's a great way to put
Perfectly
it. Yeah.
said.
Yep.
Yeah. Very nice.
Years ago, value analysis, the intention of that in-depth clinical piece was that value analysis, not all facilities had value analysis in place. They didn't have clinicians in supply chain. And I'm talking, 13, 14 years ago, right? That was kind of newer. And I think that was also a focus of what Blue.Point was going to do, was bring that clinical research into the supply chain departments, provide them some education so that they can have talking points to go to their clinicians that they did have contact with and have some discussions on those particular whatever category that they were looking at. I think, I don't know, maybe, and then I think it's an important part of how now, especially since 2020, people have come to realize how important value analysis is in their organizations. And while their programs have gotten bigger, bandwidth has gotten smaller. And so people need a much easier way to be able to connect with the platform, understand their actionable items. And that's where our support, I think the clinical support is also a unique piece. Just in general, our model has changed from the
Okay.
Blue.Point platform, over the years because of that bandwidth getting smaller. We used to be more of a self-service where our facilities would be able to navigate the platform on their own, get the information that they needed to look at our categories and see where their opportunities are. But again, since 2020, we've noticed that shift towards, they really do rely on the clinicians here at Blue.Point. And, we have some great conversations within we have some great conversations with our customers where they're reaching out to us not only on the Blue.Point categories, but in other topics, because when they need some assistance in clinical research, or they are interested in knowing what others are doing and how others are approaching different savings opportunities, different utilization opportunities, and different problems that they're encountering at their organizations.
Yeah, that's another important piece, is that they're able to, Blue.Point can kind of point out their benchmark against other similar facilities and kind of give insight as well into how they might need to improve.
Right. Because I think one of the key parts is also, when you are looking at what your organization does within a vacuum, you look great, right? Because you don't know what anybody else is doing. So you don't know if your the carafe that you're purchasing for $1.75 is really expensive versus what other people at other hospitals are doing, until you notice, hey, wait, I am an outlier. Everybody else is using something for 75 cents. And so why is my facility spending so much more on this particular feature of a product when, you know, other 22,000 other beds in hospitals are getting a different product? Why are we that different that we need to do that? So I think there's a lot to be said for being able to have some kind of insight. And if you're in a big system, you have a lot of opportunity to look within your own IDN to see what are best practices and what others are doing. But when you're in a smaller IDN, you don't have that luxury. Or if you are one of the few who are still standalone facilities in this day and age, you can't really call up somebody up the street, another hospital, and say, hey, what are you paying for this? What are you doing for this? How much what's your utilization rate on silver foam dressings, right? And see where you fall. They're probably not going to share that information with you. And so this allows you to do that in a blinded fashion.
And who has the time to make those calls, right?
Right. If you're calling, you're probably calling because you're saying, oh my gosh, I have a patient on the table and I'm out and I need this product. Do you happen to have one?
Yeah. Exactly.
I kind of think that that's pretty neat too, that how Blue.Point can provide that without providing, like, you have all the clinical data pieces between that and not necessarily the vendor and not necessarily what the contract or however that goes, but we can provide that by giving them that clean data without being biased, if that's how you want to say it. Yeah.
Yes, because Blue.Point is GPO agnostic and vendor agnostic. We're just looking at the data.
Right.
Yeah,
So.
I had a system where they were using evacuated containers, and I think the action item was their pricing. Their average cost was $19, and everybody else in the database was at $9. And I'm thinking, what the heck are they doing that it's $19? And it turns out that they were purchasing a completely sterile evacuated container, and these are used in like paracenteses, thoracenteses. But if you are familiar with the procedure, the outside of the container does not need to be sterile because you're typically handing them off. And you're not in an OR; you're handing them to someone with, in a non-sterile. The inside has to be sterile, and which is valid and clinically appropriate. But they were paying an extra $10 to have the entire bottle sterilized, and it was an easy $100,000 savings just because of that, that oversight that they weren't aware of. Oh, I mean, everybody else in the database is using a non-sterile on the outside. So it was an interesting and easy win, but that's some of the things that our data can highlight.
Yeah. And we have more of those like impact stories on our website. So if anyone's interested, that we will have all the information for our social media and our website somewhere, depending on where you're listening or watching this podcast. In the description, you'll have access to go ahead and find us on the interwebs. So I think this is a wrap on episode 1. I think that was a good introduction to the Blue.Point team as well as Blue.Point itself, which is, as in summary, a data analytics platform that takes a data-driven approach to clinical alignment, as kind of one way to put it. So thanks for listening. Make sure to follow the show so you don't miss any of future episodes. We have some really interesting episodes and topics coming up. And remember, best practice doesn't have to cost more when you slay data with Blue.Point. So thank you. Until next time.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Note
Was
to
it-
self, I'm putting Reba in her crate next episode.
Oh, Reba.
my
Reba.
My
Did you
dog
guys
walked
see
by
her?
too.
Did you see her
No,
popping
honestly,
up? I was like,
I
get
did.
out.
Honestly, I think that's hilarious.
She's like whining. She got her foot stuck in her sweater, and then I was like, okay,
That's
I'm like
awesome.
trying to like nonchalantly like snap my fingers so
Oh,
she
there
can
she is.
work. Yeah.
Reba.
Oh.
Hi, Reba. Oh my
The
God. That's
entire
awesome.
time I was like, girl, come on.